They were the faces we welcomed into our homes, the voices of trust, the icons of charm, the legends of British screen. But behind the applause and autograph lines lay something else entirely. Secrets. Scandals. Lives so dark, even tabloids flinched. This isn't a story about fame. It's a reckoning. Because when the cameras stopped rolling, some of Britain's most beloved stars revealed their most horrifying roles. And none of them were fiction. Welcome to 23 Old British Stars with the most horrifying secret life. The truth was never part of the script. Until now. Before we dive in, if stories like this keep you watching long after midnight, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the dark side of fame. And while you're here, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop your city in the comments and tell us what time it is right now, just so we know who else can't sleep. 1. Jimmy Savile. There's a special kind of silence that follows the death of a national treasure. Not the respectful hush of mourning, but the kind that feels like a collective breath held too long, waiting for the other shoe to drop. When Jimmy Savile died in 2011, Britain entered that silence. The tributes were loud, almost performative. Knighthoods, charity fundraisers, a golden coffin. But beneath it all was a knowing that no one dared speak aloud. Not yet. Savile had mastered the illusion of eccentric innocence. With his tracksuits, tinted glasses, and gold chains, he was the nation's quirky uncle, the one who danced too long with your aunt at weddings, but who also raised millions for children's hospitals. Hospitals where he had keys. Keys to wards. Keys to silence. The truth didn't whisper. It roared after his death. Investigations revealed a decades-long pattern of abuse, enabled not in the shadows, but in broad daylight. Institutions bowed to him. The media protected him. Victims, many of them children, were ignored, doubted, or simply erased from the narrative. What makes the Savile story so chilling isn't just what he did. It's how many people saw it coming and looked away. And perhaps worst of all, it wasn't unique. He wasn't alone. He was part of something larger, something British television had quietly incubated for years. One of his longtime contemporaries painted smiling portraits for the Queen. And 2. Rolf Harris. Rolf Harris wasn't just a television personality. He was a brand, a voice that sang, "Tie me kangaroo down," a cartoonist, a painter of royal portraits. To generations, he was the very image of gentle Australian eccentricity, harmless, warm, a children's entertainer with a didgeridoo and a twinkle in his eye. But charm, in hindsight, has a way of curdling into menace. And it did. When Harris was finally convicted in 2014, it wasn't just the specifics of the charges that stunned the public. It was how deeply embedded he had been in the culture of trust. He wasn't fringe. He was prime time, state-approved. Family living rooms welcomed him for decades, which is precisely what made him dangerous. The pattern was familiar. Access to young people through fame, institutions slow to react, a legal system dragging its heels behind whispers and rumors. When the court proceedings began, Harris looked less like a villain and more like someone inconvenienced by the exposure. But jurors didn't buy it. Nor did the press at long last. What lingered after his downfall wasn't just disgust, it was disorientation. If Harris was hiding this, who else had been? Because it turned out, the industry didn't just overlook the warning signs. It had practically written them into the script. Just ask the man who used to host It's a Knockout. 2 names in, and already the mask of celebrity is slipping. If you're still with us, you're the kind of viewer who looks past the spotlight. So go ahead and subscribe. We've got more truths coming. And while you're here, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Just curious how far this darkness travels. 3. Stuart Hall. The irony is bitter. A man whose fame came from orchestrating absurd slapstick obstacle courses on British television was quietly navigating a much darker game behind the scenes. Stuart Hall wasn't just a TV host. He was the voice of regional respectability. a BBC figurehead who wore civility like a tailored suit. To question him was to question the institution itself. But when his charges surfaced in 2013, the polished facade shattered. Hall pled guilty to multiple counts of indecent assault, and the BBC, by then battered by the Savile revelations, moved quickly to distance itself. Too quickly, some thought, considering how long concerns had quietly circulated within its walls. The public's reaction was something close to fatigue. Not from disbelief, but from pattern recognition. The formula had become grotesquely predictable. Man of the people, allegations ignored, delayed justice, sudden fall. It raised uncomfortable questions about celebrity ecosystems, especially the ones rooted in affable smiles and modest Britishness. Hall wasn't a rock star or a flamboyant showman. He was ordinary, safe. And therein lay the danger. By the time his name was stripped from honors lists, it was clear. The myth of wholesome stardom was rotting from within. But rot rarely stops on its own. And the next man wasn't managing stars. He was managing their scandals. 4. Max Clifford. Max Clifford didn't need to be a star. He built them, carefully, cynically, and often from scandal itself. As Britain's most notorious celebrity publicist, Clifford didn't walk red carpets. He arranged who did. He was the invisible hand behind tabloid fame, pulling strings from the shadows and deciding who rose, who fell, and what stayed hidden. In a world that rewarded secrets with front-page exclusives, Clifford trafficked in the currency of silence. So when he became the story, the irony was theatrical. Charged and convicted in 2014, Clifford fell not because of a single smoking gun, but because of a career-long pattern, an ecosystem he had helped design. His offenses weren't framed around the usual cliché of fame run wild. They were transactional, methodical, and chillingly strategic. The tabloids, once his eager collaborators, turned quickly. Former allies published long, stifled stories. Clients disavowed him, and even his courtroom defense felt flimsy, rooted more in deflection than denial. He wasn't just accused of abuse. He was seen as the man who understood how to bury it. His downfall was less about personal disgrace and more about systemic collapse. If even Clifford couldn't outrun exposure, who else might finally be caught in the net? Perhaps someone who sang his way onto screens and into the trust of millions of teens. 5. Jonathan King. Jonathan King was never subtle. His style was flamboyant, his opinions loud, and his public image? Somewhere between pop provocateur and industry insider. A music mogul turned television fixture, King lived in the spotlight and seemed to relish courting controversy. But behind the outlandish public persona was something far more sinister, and in 2001, that mask cracked wide open. Convicted for sexual offenses involving underage boys, King's trial wasn't just another celebrity scandal. It was a moment of reckoning. The headlines weren't playful. The courtroom was not a stage, and the legacy he had so carefully curated through TV specials and music awards unraveled overnight. What made King's case distinct was how completely fame had insulated him. He was powerful, connected, and fluent in media manipulation. But none of that saved him from conviction. Even his later attempts to challenge the narrative, through appeals, documentaries, interviews, only emphasized how deeply he misunderstood the gravity of what had occurred. To him, it was a PR battle. To everyone else, it was a reckoning long overdue. By the time the credits rolled on his public career, King had become a cautionary tale. Not about eccentricity, but about impunity. And next came another radio darling, this time with just enough deniability to stay on air longer than most. 6. Dave Lee. Travis. Dave Lee. Travis had the voice of an era. A deep, affable baritone that once soundtracked millions of British mornings on Radio 1. He was the kind of broadcaster people trusted without question. Part of the wallpaper of daily life, never quite a headline, always a presence. Which is what made the allegations and eventual conviction so difficult for some fans to reconcile. His trial was messy, Multiple charges, multiple outcomes. Some accusations led nowhere. Others stuck. In 2014, he was convicted of a single count of indecent assault. One incident. But the courtroom wasn't a referendum on quantity. It was a judgment on conduct, power, and trust. Travis never quite embodied the monstrous archetype. That's what made the case harder for the public to parse. He wasn't extreme, he was familiar. A reminder that harm doesn't always come with dramatic music and a villain's glare. Sometimes it wears headphones and plays your favorite song. What's often overlooked is how long the industry looked away. Or how quickly the headline shifted after the trial, as if complexity made the narrative less convenient. But this wasn't about convenience. It was about recognition. And if recognition took decades, what about the ones who stayed invisible the longest? Operating in Savile's shadow, but just as untouchable. 7. Ray Teret. In another world, Ray Teret would have remained a footnote, a minor DJ with a regional fan base and a dated sense of humor. But history has a brutal way of reclassifying the irrelevant. Once known primarily for his proximity to Jimmy Savile, Teret's legacy now reads like a blueprint of learned behavior. Someone who wasn't just adjacent to power, but actively modeling himself after it. Dubbed the Rat by tabloids, less for flair and more for accuracy, Teret built his career in the 1960s on second-hand charisma. He wasn't Savile's rival. He was his disciple. And while the spotlight never really found him during his broadcasting years, it came crashing down in 2014 when he was convicted of multiple offenses dating back to the 1970s. What shocked the public wasn't just the conviction, it was the pattern. The closeness to Savile, the similar methods, the overlapping institutions that, once again, seemed reluctant to connect the dots. It wasn't about one bad actor. It was about a scene. Teret's downfall, if it can be called that, wasn't high profile. It didn't dominate primetime news or spark national mourning. But it quietly deepened the sense that these men hadn't operated alone. They had networks, echo chambers. And in the next case, the weather forecast would come with something far darker than rain. 8. Fred Talbot. Fred Talbot was a cheerful man with a map. If you were watching British breakfast television in the 1980s and 90s, you probably saw him hop onto a floating weather map, smiling as he pointed out high-pressure zones and cold fronts. His on-screen energy was mild, agreeable, harmless. And that was the point. Talbot built his persona around charm and accessibility. But when serious allegations surfaced and later led to convictions, his entire career took on a different tone. The weather wasn't the story anymore. It was the proximity. To schools, to programs, to young audiences who knew him not as a man, but as a trusted presence on morning TV. His conviction in the 2010s transformed him overnight from quirky staple to cautionary symbol. The polite broadcaster with a flair for live stunts had, it turned out, left behind a very different trail off-screen, one that pointed to long-standing abuses of access and an industry unwilling to confront what was hiding behind the smile. Talbot didn't just fall from grace. He helped illustrate how thin the boundary was between education and entertainment, between trust and assumption. And yet, in some cases, even those boundaries didn't exist at all. Like the next man, whose crimes were never national headlines, but whose story is somehow even more quietly harrowing. 9. Peter Rowell. Peter Rowell was never a household name. He didn't have the star power of a Savile or the television ubiquity of a Rolf Harris. But in many ways, that made his case even more unsettling. He was local, familiar, a regional radio and television presenter who built his career on credibility and warmth, the kind of face that introduced school programs, the kind of voice that read community news. You'd forget him the moment the show ended, and that was the danger. In 2012, Rowell was jailed after admitting to several serious offenses. The reporting didn't sensationalize him. It didn't need to. The facts themselves were stark enough. The use of trust, local prominence, and institutional access as shields. In many ways, his case slipped under the national radar, not because it lacked weight, but because it was so ordinary, so painfully, disturbingly ordinary. He wasn't protected by fame. He was protected by banality. And that's what made the case resonate in investigative circles. How many others like him had existed, just low profile enough to avoid scrutiny, just respected enough to escape doubt? By the time his case faded from public memory, it had already become a footnote in a larger reckoning, a reckoning that, tragically, would come full circle with one of Britain's former child stars. 10. John Alford. John Alford was supposed to be a success story, a teenage breakout on Grange Hill, then a heroic turn in London's Burning. He embodied the young working-class lad who made it. The kind of actor British tabloids loved to elevate, right up until they didn't. His fall from grace wasn't as dramatic as some others on this list, but in many ways, it felt more modern. Less about decades of hidden behavior, and more about a collapse in real time. Alford's early brushes with the law were drug-related, dismissed by some as the antics of a washed-up soap star. But in 2022, headlines changed. The offenses weren't framed as youthful indiscretions anymore. They were serious, recent, and confirmed by a court. His conviction marked a stark contrast from his on-screen image, and for many served as a jarring reminder that even the actors they grew up with, those cast as role models or good lads, were not immune to the darker patterns seen in other parts of the industry. What Alford's case underscores is the uncomfortable continuity between the old-school era of showbiz impunity and the newer world of fame's aftershocks. Stardom might fade, but the power dynamics linger, and some stars carried darker secrets with them into their most iconic roles, like the man once known to millions as Dirty Den. 11. Leslie Grantham. Leslie Grantham was the face of British television's golden age of soaps. As Dirty Den on EastEnders, he wasn't just a character, he was an institution. Charismatic, cunning, and oddly likable despite the scheming, Grantham's presence dominated screens and shaped what gritty British TV drama looked like for a generation. But before the fame, before the monologues and cliffhangers, there was something else. Something far harder to romanticize. Years before he became a household name, Grantham had served prison time for killing a taxi driver during a botched robbery in Germany. The conviction was real. The sentence was long. And yet, by the 1980s, the BBC had cast him as a leading man. The public mostly knew, but they didn't care, or they pretended not to. It was the era of rehabilitation, after all, and Dirty Den's smirk made good ratings. Grantham's case wasn't about hidden offenses. It was about public forgiveness, or selective amnesia. The question wasn't whether the industry knew. It was whether it mattered, and what that says about the kinds of sins we're willing to forget when the audience numbers are high enough. Because the next man on the list didn't have a conviction. But the allegations, public, messy, and widely reported, still cost him everything. 12. Peter Adamson. Peter Adamson was the brick and mortar of Coronation Street, a staple character whose gruff, dependable role helped define the tone of Britain's longest-running soap. As Lynn Fairclough, he was part of the furniture, and for decades, audiences barely distinguished between the man and the character. That illusion shattered in the early 1980s when Adamson faced deeply serious allegations involving children. He was taken to trial and acquitted. But by the time the verdict came in, the damage was done. In the public eye, the line between accusation and guilt blurred instantly. Newspapers swarmed, producers panicked, and within months, Adamson was dismissed from the show. Officially, it wasn't about the allegations. It was about breaking a media contract. Unofficially, everyone knew what had driven the decision. He never returned to the screen in any meaningful way. His career ended not with a final scene, but with a tabloid headline. Adamson's story exists in that morally gray space. No conviction, but a legacy reshaped by suspicion. It's a story not just about what happened, but about how quickly trust evaporates in the court of public opinion. And that court is rarely merciful, especially not to stars who once played icons of suave masculinity, like the cult actor whose real-life scandal ended his career with a whisper, not a bang. 13. Peter Wyngarde. Peter Wyngarde was once the definition of cool. With his velvet suits, waxed mustache, and languid drawl, he became a cult icon in the 1960s and 70s, first in Department S, then as the flamboyant Jason King. He was suave, witty, unapologetically eccentric. A man who seemed to have stepped out of his own script, all cigarette smoke and double entendres. But in 1975, the illusion faltered. Wyngarde was convicted of gross indecency in a public incident that, at the time, spelled professional exile. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. Television work dried up. Roles vanished. And though some fans and colleagues expressed support, the industry's doors largely closed. It wasn't just about the legal outcome. It was about the era. The 1970s still criminalized parts of private life, and one misstep, public or not, could destroy everything. What makes Wyngarde's case different is that, unlike others on this list, the scandal wasn't rooted in exploitation or abuse. It was about how fame collapsed under moral scrutiny. He became a casualty of a system that punished identity more than intent. And yet, in the shadows of that same system, others operated freely. Men who avoided scandal not because they behaved better, but because they blended in. Like the next actor, a sitcom legend whose on-screen gruffness concealed a private life veiled in whispered rumors and hard-to-confirm accounts. 14. Wilfrid Brambell. To millions, Wilfrid Brambell was Albert's steptoe, the cranky, foul-mouthed rag-and-bone man from Steptoe and Son, whose endless arguments with his long-suffering son became a staple of British comedy. He was unforgettable, iconic, and in many ways the archetype of a generation's grumbling working-class father figure. But behind the scenes, Brambell led a far more complicated and far more fragile existence. In 1962, he was arrested and prosecuted for importuning in a public toilet. At the time, the term was a catch-all for criminalized same-sex conduct, and for Brambell, it was a near-career-ending scandal. Though the matter didn't result in prolonged incarceration, it cast a shadow over his professional life. And while he continued to work, the event followed him, never quite headline news, but always lurking in the footnotes. Later in the years after his death, darker rumors surfaced, allegations that were never tested in court, never fully substantiated, but often repeated in books and retrospectives. Separating fact from folklore became almost impossible. What remained was a man caught between two forms of scrutiny: the moral panic of his time and the retrospective curiosity of ours. And in the next case, the collision between personal identity and public punishment came earlier, harsher, and somehow more revealing, because this next man was theater royalty. 15. Sir John Gielgud. Sir John Gielgud was more than an actor. He was a pillar, a titan of British theater whose voice could summon Shakespearean ghosts and command silence with a single breath. For decades, he played kings, poets, and complex men with unshakable dignity. But in 1953, Gielgud himself became the center of a real-life drama that would haunt him for the rest of his life. That year, he was arrested and convicted for importuning, the same charge Brambell would later face, after approaching an undercover officer in a public restroom. The scandal was immediate and devastating. Newspapers ridiculed him, politicians denounced him, and for a moment it seemed as though the curtain had fallen for good. But something strange happened. When Gielgud returned to the stage shortly afterward, the audience gave him a standing ovation. Not out of sympathy necessarily, but as a kind of collective contradiction. Society condemned, but theater forgave. It was a rare moment of dissonance in a time of harsh moral laws. The conviction remained on his record, but it didn't end his career. Instead, it quietly reframed it. His later performances carried a weight they hadn't before. And yet, his case raises the same uncomfortable question as many others here. Where's the line between personal ruin and public redemption? A question that becomes even murkier when the artist in question wasn't punished at all, despite disturbing claims from the very actresses who helped cement his legacy. 16. Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock didn't need to appear on screen to haunt it. The shadow he cast was cinematic, psychological, and, in hindsight, deeply personal. Known as the master of suspense, he directed some of the most iconic films of the 20th century: Psycho, The Birds, Rear Window, each filled with tension, obsession, and a chilling sense of control. But behind the camera, Hitchcock's private conduct with his leading ladies told another story, one that wouldn't fully come to light until decades after the credits rolled. Actress Tippi Hedren, among others, later spoke openly about the pressure and intimidation she experienced under Hitchcock's watch. Accounts described a working environment that blurred professional lines and left actresses feeling trapped between career opportunity and personal discomfort. Studios, predictably, did little. In the golden age of Hollywood, directors were allowed their eccentricities, especially if they delivered box office gold. What makes Hitchcock's legacy so difficult to unpack is its scale. His genius is unquestioned. So is the discomfort many now feel revisiting his work, knowing what the women at the heart of his films endured. It's not about rewriting history, it's about acknowledging the layers beneath the glossy film reels. And yet, if Hitchcock weaponized creative power, the next name on the list wielded legal chaos like a cudgel, masking deeply unsettling behavior with lawsuits, scandals, and a stubborn refusal to go quietly. 17. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was once the most recognizable man on earth. The bowler hat, the cane, the waddling walk, all part of a silent era persona that made people laugh through war, poverty, and social upheaval. But Chaplin's off-screen life was a far cry from the innocent charm of the tramp. In fact, his personal relationships, and the legal turmoil surrounding them, left a trail of moral unease that still clouds his legacy. Chaplin's romantic history was notoriously chaotic, especially his preference for much younger partners, some still in their teens. It wasn't illegal by the standards of the day, but it drew intense public scrutiny and ethical concern. A high-profile paternity suit in the 1940s, combined with an investigation under the Mann Act, thrust Chaplin into a media firestorm. Though he was never convicted, the reputational damage was lasting. In a rare twist of cinematic irony, the U.S. government effectively exiled him, not for his personal life, but under suspicions of communist sympathy. He left America and rarely returned. Biographers have since debated the weight of his private life against his artistic contributions, but the contradiction remains. A man who embodied humanity on screen, and yet struggled profoundly with it off-screen. Next came another star of stage and screen, whose courtroom story didn't result in conviction, but whose public fall was no less dramatic. 18. Freddie Starr. Freddie Starr was chaos in a suit. He rose to fame in the 1970s and 80s as a variety show comedian whose unpredictable antics made him both a tabloid darling and a booking risk. He was the type of performer who could charm an entire studio audience and unsettle them a moment later. But decades after his heyday, Starr's name re-entered the headlines, this time in connection to serious allegations that dragged him into a high-profile legal battle. In 2015, Starr sued one of his accusers for libel after being publicly named in the context of a broader investigation into historic abuse. The trial became a media spectacle, less about legal definitions and more about public image. Starr lost the case, with the judge ruling the allegations credible enough, even if no criminal charges had been filed. He maintained his innocence until his death. The fallout was swift. Bookings evaporated. Public appearances grew rare. Though never convicted, he became yet another figure, associated with the dark cloud hanging over Britain's entertainment past, a reminder that even unproven claims can shift the narrative, especially when public trust is already frayed. And for the next man, that trust was obliterated not by trial, but by the brutal contrast between his wholesome image and the seedy revelations that followed. 19. Frank Bough. Frank Bough was the face of respectable British television. In the 1970s and 80s, he anchored Nationwide and Grandstand, the kind of programs that sat gently in the background of millions of homes, radiating calm authority. Bough didn't just read the news, he embodied trust. He was the reassuring voice of a nation that believed its presenters were somehow better, cleaner, more solid than the rest of us. And then the curtain was pulled back. In the late 1980s, newspapers revealed that behind the wholesome image was a private life spiraling out of control. Reports described drug use and secret visits to seedy clubs, a double life so far removed from his on-screen persona that the public barely knew how to process it. The BBC acted quickly, severing ties and quietly removing him from the schedule, as if erasing his name might also erase the discomfort he caused. Bough's fall was not about a courtroom verdict. It was about betrayal. Viewers felt fooled, and the press delighted in the contrast between the gentle broadcaster and the chaotic man behind closed doors. His story became a template for future scandals. Build a perfect image, then watch it implode under the weight of reality. Yet compared to what followed, Bough's collapse almost looks quaint. The next man didn't just test the limits of decorum. He lived as if chaos itself were a form of art. 20. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed was never subtle. While others polished their public images, Reed bulldozed his way through life with a glass in one hand and a snarl in the other. A gifted actor known for Women in Love, The Devils, and later Gladiator, Reed was also infamous for his volatility. Interviews, parties, film sets, nothing was safe from his temper or his excess. Biographies and long-form profiles paint a picture of a man who treated the world as a proving ground. He drank heavily, fought loudly, and cultivated a reputation as a wild, uncontrollable force. For a long time, the industry indulged him. His outbursts were framed as hellraiser behavior, part of the myth of the tortured male genius. But beneath the bravado were countless stories of people hurt, intimidated, or simply worn down by being near him. Reed's legacy is now viewed through a harsher lens. What was once glamorized now looks like a trail of wreckage. The idea that talent should excuse everything else has lost its charm, and Reed stands as a reminder of how easily cruelty can be mistaken for charisma. And yet, even Reed's chaos had limits. The next name on this list represents something more quietly corrosive. A beloved comic whose jovial persona hid a far more troubling private life. 21. Sid James. Sid James laughed for a living. As the roguish star of the Carry On films and Bless This House, his trademark wheeze and cheeky grin made him one of Britain's most recognizable faces. He played lovable rascals, leering uncles, and cheeky schemers, characters that audiences embraced with affectionate familiarity. But behind the camera, James lived a life that many biographers now describe as deeply unsettling. Accounts from those who knew him speak of heavy gambling, constant financial chaos, and a string of tumultuous relationships. His personal life was dominated by addiction, impulsive behavior, and a pattern of mistreatment that contrasted sharply with his warm comic image. In the entertainment industry of the mid-20th century, much of this was brushed aside as eccentricity or even charm. The line between bad behavior and comic legend was blurred until it almost disappeared. Only later did a more sobering picture emerge, a man whose humor masked a cycle of harm to himself and to others. Sid James wasn't just playing the rogue. In many ways, he was living it, and the laughter around him made it easier to ignore the cost. And that leaves one final figure, a woman whose fame was built on glamour, whose life was shaped by control and exploitation, and whose story still feels like a warning echoing through the corridors of celebrity. 22. Diana Dors. Diana Dors was Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe. Blonde, bold, and relentlessly glamorous. From the moment she arrived on screen in the 1950s, Dors knew how to control a room. She leaned into her bombshell image with unapologetic flair, navigating an industry that often preferred its women beautiful, silent, and compliant. But behind the bright lights and tabloid headlines, her life was tangled in something far darker: manipulation, coercion, and a disturbing proximity to the criminal underworld. Biographers and journalists have wrestled with the contradictions of Dors's story for decades. She wasn't simply exploited. At times, she was a participant in her own mythology. Reports of wild parties, secret recordings, and power struggles swirl around her legacy, though many of the most salacious claims remain contested or biography-dependent. What's clear is that Dors existed in a system that commodified her, then punished her for surviving it too well. By the time of her death in the 1980s, the public viewed her with a mix of fascination and judgment. She'd become a cultural Rorschach test, glamour icon to some, cautionary tale to others. But Dors' story isn't just about one woman. It's about the entire scaffolding of mid-century fame and how it collapsed inward. And as we reach the final name on this list, we meet a man whose legendary voice and volcanic presence masked a life full of turmoil and left behind a legacy built as much on damage as on genius. 23. Richard Burton. Richard Burton didn't just act, he detonated. His voice, his presence, his off-screen romances all seemed too big for any stage or screen to contain. A titan of post-war British cinema, Burton was the kind of actor who made Shakespeare sound dangerous and a vodka bottle look like a birthright. But behind the talent was a man constantly at war, with himself, with his lovers, and with the myth he was supposed to embody. Burton's private life was a tornado of addiction, conflict, and emotional upheaval. His tempestuous relationship with Elizabeth Taylor became a global obsession, more famous at times than the films they made together. But while the tabloids turned their fights into punchlines and photo spreads, biographies painted a bleaker picture. Volatility wasn't a narrative device. It was daily reality. The romanticism surrounding their bond often masked the darker undertones of dependence and instability. Burton never stood trial, never faced criminal proceedings. And yet the portrait that emerges is no less uncomfortable. He was a man adored for his brilliance, tolerated for his chaos, and rarely challenged for the harm left in his wake. And now the credits roll, but not on resolution. Because these 23 figures weren't anomalies. They were symptoms of a culture that chose applause over accountability, charisma over conscience. A culture that still hasn't fully reckoned with how much it's willing to forgive in the name of fame.